All right, welcome back. We are in part 8, and we are looking at the witness statements about the connection between Solomon Spaulding's manuscript found and the Book of Mormon. And so we looked at Joseph Miller, and he actually wrote something else after his first letter. So he says, I was well acquainted with Mr. Spaulding while he lived in Amity, Pennsylvania. I would say he was 55 to 60 years of age and in person, tall and spare, considerably stooped, caused in part, I think, from a severe rupture. His hair was quite gray. He was chaste in language and dignified in manner, becoming his profession. I never heard him preach. Think he never preached at Amity. Said he had quit preaching on account of ill health. He kept a public house or tavern of the character common to that day. He died of dysentery in 1816, in the fall, I think. After an illness of 6 or 8 weeks, Dr. Cephas Dodd had attended him. I watched with him many nights during this illness. After he died, I made his coffin and superintended his burial. One night, when he was near his end, he told me he thought he should die and requested me to assist his wife in settling his estate. And according, I, with Colonel Benham, went on her bond as administratrix, and I helped her close it up. Mrs. Spaulding was intelligent and of pleasing manners, with fair complexion, and say from 35 to 40 years of age. A child of fair complexion and about 14 years of age lived with them here. Think she was their daughter, as she bore the Spaulding name. Mr. Spaulding was poor but honest. I endorsed for him twice to borrow money. His house was a place of common resort, especially in the evening. I was prosecuting my trade, carpenter, in the village, and frequent his house. Mr. Spaulding seemed to take delight in reading from his manuscript written on foolscap for the entertainment of his frequent visitors. Heard him read most, if not all of it, and had frequent conversations with him about it. Some time ago, I had in my possession for about 6 months the Book of Mormon and heard most of it read during the time. I was always forcibly struck with the similarity of the portions of it which purported to be of supernatural origin to the quaint style and peculiar language that had made such a deep impression on my mind when hearing the manuscript read by Mr. Spaulding. For instance, the very frequent repetition of the phrase, "and it came to pass." Then, on hearing read the account from the book of the battle between the Amalekites and the Nephites, in which the soldiers of one army had placed a red mark on their foreheads to distinguish them from their enemies, it seemed to reproduce in my mind not only the narrative, but the very words, as they had been impressed on my mind by the reading of Spaulding's manuscript. The object of Mr. Spaulding in writing the manuscript found, as I understood, was to employ an invalid's lonely imagination to support a romantic history of those lost races or tribes whose true history remains buried with their dust beneath those mysterious mounds so common in a large portion of our country. Its publication seemed to be an afterthought, most likely suggested by pecuniary embarrassment. My recollection is that Mr. Spaulding had left a transcript of the manuscript with Mr. Patterson of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and for publication. That its publication was delayed until Mr. Spaulding would write a preface, and in the meantime the transcript was spirited away and could not be found. Mr. Spaulding told me that Sidney Rigdon had taken it, or that he was suspicioned of it for it. Recollect distinctly that Rigdon's name was used in that connection. The longer I live, the more firmly I'm convinced that Spaulding's manuscript was appropriated and largely used in getting up the Book of Mormon. I believe that leaving out of the book the portion that may be easily recognized as the work of Joe Smith and his accomplices, that Solomon Spaulding may be truly said to be its author. I have no doubt, have not a doubt of it. And then he would write, sorry, I accidentally said that twice. Put that down twice. And then we have, in 1880, Matilda McKinstry, the daughter, writes about it. So she says, so much has been published that is erroneous concerning the manuscript found, written by my father, the Reverend Solomon Spaulding, and its supposed connection with the book called the Mormon Bible. I have willingly consented to make the following statement regarding it, repeating all that I remember personally of this manuscript and all that is of importance which my mother related to me in connection with it, at the same time affirming that I am in tolerable health and vigor, and that my memory, in common with elderly people, is clearer in regards to the events of my earlier years rather than those of my maturer life. During the War of 1812, I was residing with my parents in a little town in Ohio called Conneaut. I was in my 6th year. My father was in business there. I remember his iron foundry and the men he had at work. but he remained at home most of the time and was reading and writing a great deal. He frequently wrote little stories which he read to me. There are some round mounds of earth near our house which greatly interested him. He said a tree on the top of one of them was 1,000 years old. He set some of his men to work digging into one of these mounds, and I vividly remember how excited he became when he heard that they had exhumed some human bones, portions of gigantic skeletons, and various relics. He talked with my mother of these discoveries in the mound, and was writing every day as the work progressed. Afterward, he read the manuscript which I had seen him writing to the neighbors and to the clergyman, a friend of his, who came to see him. Some of the names that he mentioned while reading to these people I've never forgotten. They're fresh to me as today as though I heard them yesterday. Mormon. They were Mormon, Moroni, Lamanite, Nephi. We removed from Conneaut to Pittsburgh while I was still very young, but every circumstance of this removal is distinct in my memory. In that city, my father had an intimate friend named Patterson, and I frequently visited Mr. Patterson's library with him and heard my father talk about books with him. In 1816, my father died at Almaty, Pennsylvania, and directly after his death, my mother and myself went to visit at the residence of my mother's brother, William H. Sabine, at Onondaga Valley, Onondaga County, New York. Mr. Sabine was a lawyer of distinction and wealth and greatly respected. We carried all of our personal effects with us, and one of these was an old trunk in which my mother had placed all my father's writings, which had been preserved. I perfectly remember the appearance of this trunk and of looking at its contents. There were sermons and other papers, and I saw a manuscript about an inch thick, closely written, tied with some of the stories my father had written for me, one of which he called The Frogs of Wyndham. On the outside of this manuscript were written the words, "Manuscript found." I did not read it, but I looked through it and had it in my hands many times, and saw the names I had heard at Conneaut when my father read it to his friends. I was about 11 years of age at this time. After we had been at my uncle's for some time, my mother left me there and went to her father's house at Pomfret, Connecticut, but did not take her furniture nor the old trunk of manuscripts with her. In 1820, she married Mr. Davidson of Hartwick's, a village near Cooperstown, New York, and sent for the things she had left at Onondaga Valley. And I remember that the old trunk with its contents reached her in safety. In 1828, I was married to Dr. McKinstry of Monson, Hampton County, Massachusetts, and went there to reside. Very soon after, my mother joined me there and was with me most of the time until her death in 1844. We heard not long after she came to live with me, I do not remember just how long, something of Mormonism, and the report that it had been taken from my father's manuscript found. And then came to us direct an account of the Mormon meeting at Conneaut, Ohio, and that on one occasion when the Mormon Bible was read there in public, my father's brother John Spalding, Mr. Lake, and many other persons who were present at once recognized its similarity to the manuscript found, which they had heard read years before by my father in the same town. There was a great deal of talk and a great deal published at this time about Mormonism all over the country. I believe it was in 1834, but 1833, that a man named Holbert came to my house at Monson to see my mother, who told us that he had been sent by a committee to procure the manuscript found written by the Reverend Solomon Spalding, so as to compare it with the Mormon Bible. He presented a letter to my mother from my uncle William H. Sabine of Onondaga Valley, in which he requested her to loan this manuscript to Holbert, as he, my uncle, was desirous to uproot, as he expressed it, this Mormon fraud. Holbert represented that he had been a convert to Mormonism, but had given it up, and through the manuscript found, wished to expose its wickedness. My mother was careful to have me with her in all the conversations she had with Holbert, who spent a day at my house. She did not like his appearance and mistrusted his motives, but having great respect for her brother's wishes and opinions, she reluctantly consented to his request. The old trunk contained the desired manuscript found. She had placed in the care of Mr. Jerome Clark of Hartwick's, whom she came to Monson, intending to send for it. On the repeated promise of Holbert to return the manuscript to us, she gave him a letter to Mr. Clark to open the trunk and deliver it to him. We afterwards heard that he had received it from Mr. Clark at Hartwick's, but from that time we had never had it in our possession, and I have no present knowledge of its existence, Holbert never returning it or answering letters requesting him to do so. 2 years ago I heard he was still living in Ohio, and with my consent he was asked for the manuscript found. He made no response, although we have evidence that he received the letter containing the request. So far I have stated facts within my own knowledge. My mother mentioned many other circumstances to me in connection with this subject which are interesting, of my father's literary taste, his fine education, and peculiar temperament. She stated to me that he had heard the manuscript alluded to read by my father, was familiar with its contents. and she deeply regretted that her husband, as she believed, had innocently been the means of furnishing matter for a religious delusion. She said that my father loaned this manuscript found to Mr. Patterson of Pittsburgh, and that when he returned it to my father, he said, "Polish it up, finish it, and you will make money out of it." My mother confirmed my remembrance of my father's fondness for history and told me of his frequent conversations regarding a theory which he had of a prehistoric race which had inhabited this continent, etc., all showing that his mind dwelt on this subject. The manuscript found, she said, was a romance written in biblical style, and that while she heard it read, she had no especial admiration for it more than for other romance he wrote and read to her. We never either of us ever saw or in any way communicated with the Mormons, save Hulbert, as above described, and while we had no personal knowledge that the Mormon Bible was taken from the manuscript found, there were many evidences to us that it was, and that Hulbert and others at the time thought so. A convincing proof to us of this belief was that my uncle William Sabine had undoubtedly read the manuscript while it was in his house, and his faith that its production would show to the world that the Mormon Bible had been taken from it, or was the same with slight alterations. I have frequently answered questions which have been asked me by different persons regarding the manuscript found, but until now have never made a statement at length for publication. Signed, M.S. McKinstry. So we have her statement. Then 1 year later, we have Abner Jackson. And he says, "It is a fact well established that the book called the Book of Mormon had its origin from a romance that was written by Solomon Spaulding in Conneaut, a small village in Ashtabula County, Ohio, about AD 1812. Spaulding was a highly educated man about 6 feet high, of rather slender build, with a dark complexion, black eyes, black hair, rather slow of speech, never trifling, pleasant in conversation, but seldom laughed aloud. His deportment was grave and dignified in society. He was much respected by those of his acquaintance. He was a clergyman of the Presbyterian order, and for a time a settled pastor in the city of New York. So said his brother John Spaulding and others in the neighborhood who heard him preach. It was said that failing health caused him to resign the pastorate. He then came to Richfield, Otsego County, New York, and started a store near where my father lived, about the beginning of the present century. Spaulding contracted for large tracts of land along the shore of Lake Erie on each side of the state line in both Pennsylvania and Ohio. My father exchanged with him the farm on which he lived in Otsego County, New York, for land in Erie County, Pennsylvania, where the town of Albion now stands, and moved on in 1805. It was in a dense forest. Shortly after my father moved, Spaulding sold his store in Richfield, then moved to Conneaut, Ashtabula County, Ohio, and built a forge on Conneaut Creek, 2 miles from Conneaut Harbor and 2 miles from the state line. In building this, he failed, sold out, and about the beginning of the year 1812, commenced to write his famous romance called by him The Manuscript Found. And notice that. He believes that at the beginning of the year 1812, that Solomon Spaulding started the second manuscript. This romance Mr. Spaulding brought with him on a visit to my father a short time before he moved from Conneaut to Pittsburgh. At that time, I was confined in the house with a lame knee, and so I was in company with them and heard the conversations that passed between them. Spaulding read much of his manuscript to my father, in conversation with him, explained his views of the old fortifications in this country, and told his romance. Now, it's very interesting if this person he's talking about, is this one of the Jacksons that well, just forgot his name, Winchester, was talking about. But of course, you remember Winchester talked about how this other Jackson knew about the first manuscript. So this is where, unfortunately, some of the jigsaw puzzle pieces just don't fit. Anyways, so it says, a note in Morse's geography suggested as a possibility that our Indians were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Said Morse that they might have wandered through Asia up to Bering Strait, across the strait to this continent. Besides, there were habits and ceremonies among them that resembled some habits and ceremonies among the Israelites of that day. Then the old fortifications and earth mounds contained so many kinds of relics and human bones, and some of them so large altogether convinced him that they were a large race and more enlightened and civilized than are found among the Indians among us to this day. At this day, these facts are reflections and prompted him to write his romance, purporting to be a history of the lost tribes of Israel. He begins with their departure from Palestine or Judea, then up through Asia, points out their exposures, hardships, and sufferings, also their disputes and quarrels, especially when they built their own craft for passing over the straits. Then after their landing, he gave an account of their divisions and subdivisions under different leaders, but 2 parties controlled the balance. One of them was called the righteous, worshippers and servants of God. These were organized with prophets, priests, and teachers for the education of their children and settled down to cultivate the soil and to a life of civilization. The others were idolaters. They contended for a life of idleness. In short, a wild, wicked, savage life. They soon quarreled and then commenced a war anew, continued to fight, except at very short intervals. Sometimes one party was successful and sometimes the other, until finally a terrible battle was fought, which was conclusive. All the righteous were slain except one, and he was a chief prophet and recorder. He was notified of the defeat in time by divine authority, told where, when, and how to conceal the record. He would take care that it should be preserved, brought to light again at the proper time for the benefit of mankind. So the recorder professed to do, and then submitted it to his fate. I do not remember what the fate was. He was left alone of his party. I do not remember that anything more was said of him. So that was Abner Jackson, what he wrote. Spalding's romance professed to find the record, where the recorder concealed it in one of those mounds, one of which was but a few rods from Spalding's residence. Soon after this visit, Spalding moved to Pittsburgh, took his manuscript to the Pittsburgh Gazette office, intending to have it printed, but in this he failed. My brother, J.J. Jackson, was a recruiting officer in the U.S. Army and stationed at Pittsburgh at that time. Being well acquainted with Spalding and his lady, he soon found them, and in his letters home would inform us how they were getting along. The last account he gave us of them was he was selling pictures and she was sewing up clothing for the soldiers. The next we heard of them was by report. Spalding moved to Amity, Washington County, Pennsylvania, and soon after died and was buried there. Spalding frequently read his manuscript to the neighbors and amused them as he progressed with his work. He wrote it in the Bible style, and it came to pass. Occurred so many often that some called him, "O come to pass." So much for Spalding's romance. Now for the Book of Mormon. The first account of the Book of Mormon that I saw was a notice in my father's newspaper saying that Joseph Smith, Jr. professed having dreamed that an angel had appeared to him and told him to go and search in a place he named in Palmyra, New York, and he would find a gold leaf Bible. Smith was incredulous and did not go until the second or third time he dreamed the same dream. Then he said he went, and to his surprise he found the golden Bible according to his dreams. But it was written in a language so ancient that none could be found able to either to read it or to tell him what language it was written. Sometime after another statement appeared that an angel had consented to read it and interpret it to Joseph Smith, that he should report it to a third person who should write it in plain English so that all might read the new Bible and understand its import. Sometime after, in 1830, the book was published in Palmyra, New York, called a New Revelation, the Book of Mormon. This purports to be a history of the lost tribes of the children of Israel. It begins with them just where the romance did, and it follows the romance very closely. It's true that there are some verbal alterations and additions, enlarging the production somewhat without changing its main features. The Book of Mormon follows the romance too closely to be a stranger. In both, many persons appear having the same name, as Moroni, Mormon, Nephites, Moroni, Lama, Nephi, and others. Here then, and he obviously spelled those names wrong, right? Here then we are presented with romance second called the Book of Mormon, telling the same story of the same people, traveling from the same plane, in the same way, having the same difficulties and destination, and with the same wars, same battles, and same results, with thousands upon thousands slain. Then see the Mormon account of the last battle at Cumorah, where all the righteous were slain. They were called the Nephites, the other were called Lamanites. See Moroni's account of the closing scene. And it came to pass, so the great battle was fought at Cumorah, the Lamanites slew all the Nephites, except Moroni. And he said, I will write and hide the recorder in the earth, and whither I go, it matters not. I say before that I knew nothing of Spalding after he moved to Pittsburgh, except by letters and newspapers. He soon moved to Amity, Washington County, Pennsylvania. Shortly after that, he died. But I've seen both of these productions, heard Spalding read much of his romance to my father, and explain his views and reasons for writing it. I also have seen and read the Book of Mormon. It follows Spalding's romance too closely to be anything else than a borrowed production from the romance. I think that Mrs. McKinstry's statement fills a gap in my account from Spalding's removal to Pittsburgh to the death of his wife in 1844. I wish if my statement is published that hers also be published with it, that the truth may be vindicated by the truth beyond any reasonable doubt. And then we have Joseph Miller again give a third statement. And this is what he writes. Dear sirs, in answering yours, I would say that I was familiar with Solomon Spalding. I worked in Amity, where he lived, and as the fashion was at that day, we all assembled at his house in the evenings as he kept tavern, frequently would read from his manuscript. The work was very odd. The words, moreover, and it came to pass, occurred so often that the boys about the village called him, came to pass. He told me he lived in Ohio when he wrote his manuscript. He said he lost his health and he commenced writing a history of the mounds near where he lived, or of the people who built them. He afterwards removed to Pittsburgh and kept a little store to support his family. And while there, he took his manuscript to Mr. Patterson and engaged him a publishing house. Mr. Patterson told him if he would write a title page, he would publish it. He left a copy and moved it to Amity. He afterwards went back to have his manuscript published, but it could not be found. He said there was a man named Sidney Rigdon about the office, and he thought he had stolen it. The passage you refer to on page 148 is Creeper has it in his reference to being marked with red in their foreheads, Nephites. I recollect distinctly, as occurring very often. As to Lamanites, it's not so distinct, and a great many other names that were very odd. The manuscript that I saw would not, I think, make as large a book as the Book of Mormon. Spalding was a very poor man during his stay at Amity. I was very familiar with him, bailed him for money at least twice, and by request of Spalding assisted his wife in setting up his little business, made his coffin, and helped lay him in his grave. And then we have this very, very long statement from Reddick McKee, who was interviewed by Deming. But I will show you entirely what he. I think I did take out some parts because this is so long and it just wasn't relevant to what we were talking about. But here's what Reddick McKee says. On Tuesday last, October 31st, I visited Miss McKinstry at the house of her son-in-law. Colonel Seaton found her an intelligent, active, healthy woman now in her 77th year. She appeared highly gratified at meeting with me after a separation of 66 or 67 years. Her recollections of early incidents at Amity, where we met daily during the almost 2 years I boarded in her father's family, are very fresh in her mind. And she recalled many little occurrences which have escaped my memory. Once was my giving her her first horseback ride, sitting behind me. The only thing in relation to the lost manuscript within her recollection of which you have not already learned is her remembering to have heard her mother say that before they left Pittsburgh, she accompanied her husband to the store of Mr. Patterson and heard a conversation in relation to the publication of the manuscript. Oh yeah, so he writes this, and this is a very important detail. There were two Mr. Pattersons present, one an elderly gentleman with a remarkable mild, pleasant countenance, much more robust than the other. The more slender Mr. Patterson told Mr. Spalding that he had read several chapters of the manuscript, and was struck favorably with its curious descriptions and its likeness to the ancient style of the Old Testament scriptures. This was Joseph Patterson. He thought it would be well to publish it, as it would attract attention and meet with a ready sale. He suggested, however, that Mr. Spalding should write a brief preface and perhaps a chapter or two in concluding the romance, giving a little bit more elaborate description of the Indian mounds in Ohio. Her mother thought he was engaged in doing that at the time I was living with the family at Amity. This is confirmatory of my own recollections. And like I said, this will become very important later. Sorry, I meant to say that this 1886 statement is a very long statement. That's what I meant. So here's what Reddick McKee says. He's explaining he moved to Amity to operate a store as a young man. And he says, I was introduced by Mr. Chambers to a number of citizens, confirmed the arrangement made for a storehouse, then went to the hotel or public house and was introduced to the landlord, who proved to be Mr. Solomon Spalding. He received us courteously, expressing hope that I would find the little town a pleasant residence, and that while the store would be a great convenience to the town and neighborhood, it would prove profitable to its owners. There I spent my first night in Amity. I had frequent calls from the Mr. Chambers, Mr. Spalding, and Ziba Cook, Esquire, and through them became acquainted with many others who called from curiosity or to make purchases. My business increased and continued to increase during the whole time of my stay in Amity, nearly 2 years. During all this time I was a boarder in the family of Mr. Spalding, and became quite intimate with him. He was afflicted with a serious rupture which prevented him from taking much exercise in the open air, but in good weather he called at the store almost every afternoon. I regard him as a gentleman of the old school, affable, affable in manners, and very instructive in conversation. He is about 6 feet in height, with a large frame, though much reduced in flesh, and weighing only about 150 pounds. He was well posted in the current news of the day in Europe as well as our own country. He gave me much interesting information about our late war with Great Britain, its causes and its progress, until happily concluded by the Treaty of Ghent. He deprecated the cowardly surrender of Detroit by General Hull, applauded the bravery and success of our fleets on the northern lakes, and particularly the brilliant victory of General Jackson at New Orleans. This battle was fought after the treaty had been signed. There were no steamships or telegraph wires at that day to bring the news earlier. I have since learned that Mr. Spaulding was considered the most learned man in Ashtabula County, Ohio, and that he was both a versatile and prolific writer. In Amity, I know he was a moral man, a strict observer of the Sabbath, and intent upon public worship. I had no cause to doubt his being a true believer. When the weather was inclement, I occasionally visited him in his room and always found him at his table, reading or writing. One day when I was called, he was writing upon foolscap paper, taken from some old account book. My curiosity was excited, and I said to him that if he was writing letters, I could furnish him with more suitable paper. He replied that he was not writing letters, but at another time when I had leisure, he would tell me more about it. Shortly after this, I called again, and the conversation about his writing was renewed. First, he told me of his removal from western New York to Conneaut, Ashtabula County, Ohio, where his brother John had property and afterwards resided, expecting to engage in some active business. He said in connection with Mr. Henry Lake, he built a furnace for the manufacture of iron or ironwares. This proved unprofitable and resulted in a failure which left him liable for debts to a large amount. After the failure, he had much leisure time, he said, which he had employed in examining the Indian mounds that abound in that neighborhood, and it was about them he was writing when I first called. He told me also about his other engagement at this time, but touching these I will give below his daughter's recollections recently narrated by her to me. She corroborated her father's statement about his removal to Conneaut in 1809, his examining the Indian mounds, etc., and distinctly recollected that he wrote 2 or more stories in support of the theory that the Indians of North America were lineal descendants of the Jews from Palestine. In the first of these, he brought the Jews from Palestine to America via Italy during the reign of Constantine, and set forth that at Rome they engaged shipping to convey them to some place in Great Britain, but encountering stormy weather and were finally wrecked somewhere on the coast of New England, which that would be the first manuscript. Now, he is wrong about the Jews. It was Romans, actually. But what became of the manuscript of the story she did not know with certainty, but understood it was published in some Eastern review or magazine. This romance he afterwards abandoned and set about writing a more probable story founded on the history of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. She thought her father must have had wonderful powers of imagination and memory, great command of language, and facility of description. Many of his descriptions were of a historical and religious character. Others were grotesque and ludicrous in the extreme. She remembered that in one of them, touching the mode of warfare in that day, being hand-to-hand or man-to-man, he represented one of the parties having streaks of red paint upon their cheeks and foreheads to distinguish them from enemies in battle. This story he called the manuscript found. It purported to give a history of the 10 tribes, their disputes and dissensions concerning the religion of their fathers, their division into two parties, one called Nephites, the other Lamanites, their bloody wars followed by reunion and migration via the Red Sea to the Pacific Ocean, their residence for a long time in China, their crossing the ocean by Bering Straits in North America, thus becoming the progenitors of the Indians who have inhabited or now live on this continent. And of course, evidently, probably the story was changed, right? This was a story which her Uncle John, Mr. Lake, Mr. Miller, and other neighbors heard him read at Conneaut on different occasions. They were all much interested in it and advised him strongly to have it published. Such was not his intention at first, but he finally acceded to their advice, and in the hope that from its sale he might obtain money to pay at least a portion of his indebtedness, he revised it accordingly. Hearing that there was a publishing house in Pittsburgh, he made preparations for moving to that city. To effect this, he sold his furniture and some of his books, and further assisted by his brother, made the journey, arriving, she thought, early in 1812. For the first year or two after arriving at Amity, her father seemed to be benefited in health, but in the last year of his life was occasionally very ill and confined to the house. He was fond of reading and writing, was a strict observer of the Sabbath, was intimate with Dr. Dodd, our minister, and had frequent conversations with him on religious subjects. Both were well acquainted with the Greek language of the New Testament as spoken in the days when our Savior was on earth. She also remembered Mr. Joseph Miller, who lived near the village, as a frequent visitor, who attended her father in his last illness and was with him at his death, very kindly superintending his funeral, and afterwards assisted her mother in settling up the business, preparatory to their return to western New York. Mr. Spaulding told me that at Pittsburgh he became acquainted with the Reverend Robert Patterson, who then, in an advanced life, was keeping a bookstore with a publishing department attached. He had prepared a copy of his manuscript for the printer and left it with Mr. Patterson for examination. About its publication, they had frequent conversation. Mr. Patterson thought favorably of the printing, but as manager of the publishing department, and Mr. Ingalls or English had doubts about it being remunerative and thought the author should either deposit some money to pay the expenses or at least give security for their payment. This was a damper, as he was not able at the time to meet either of the requirements, and the manuscript was laid aside in the office for further consultation. About this time, he was informed by a friend that Amity was a healthy and inexpensive place to live in. After consideration and further inquiry, he concluded to remove his family to that village, and did remove in October 1814, rented the hotel, and opened it as a public house, but without a bar. Mr. Spalding told me that while at Pittsburgh, he frequently met a young man named Sidney Rigdon at Mr. Patterson's bookstore and printing office, and concluded that he was at least an occasional employee. He was said to be a good English and Latin scholar and was studying Hebrew and Greek with a view to a professorship in some college. He had read parts of the manuscript, expressed the opinion that it would sell readily. While the question of printing was in abeyance, Mr. Spalding wrote to Mr. Patterson that if the document was not already in the hands of the printer, he wished it to be sent out to him in order that he might amend it by addition of a chapter on the discovery of valuable relics in a mound recently opened near Conduit. In reply, Mr. Patterson wrote him that the manuscript could not then be found, but that further search would be made for it. This excited Mr. Spalding's suspicion that Rigdon had taken it home. In a week or two, it was found in the place where it had originally been deposited and sent out to him. The circumstances of this finding increased Mr. Spalding's suspicions that Rigdon had taken the manuscript, made a copy of it, with a view to ultimately publishing the story as a product of his own brain. Whether the manuscript was amended and returned to Mr. Patterson, he did not tell me, but it probably was. A few days after Mr. Spalding's death, the firm of Patterson and Lambton fell in business, and it may have been purchased by Rigdon at the public sale of their assets or by some printer who removed it with the other appurtenances of the office to some town in the neighborhood, or it may have been destroyed with other rubbish in cleaning up the room. It was certainly not the document discovered by Mr. Rice at Honolulu, nor the one found by Mrs. Davidson after her return to New York in an old trunk containing his manuscripts or sermons, essays, etc. For this must have been the original or rough draft of the story. The Mormons at Conduit, a year or two after the publication of the Book of Mormon, heard of the discovery made by Mrs. Davidson and immediately determined, if possible, to get possession of the document so found, lest its publication might expose their theory. To effect this, they employed the talented, money-loving, and unscrupulous D.P. Holbert to go to Monson, Massachusetts, to obtain, if possible, the document referred to. He made the journey, and by subtlety and lying obtained an order from Mrs. Davidson on her brother, Mr. Sabine, for it, promising that it should be returned to her in a short time. This promise was never fulfilled. Returned to Conduit, he obtained a certificate from several gentlemen that it was in the handwriting of Mr. Spalding, delivered it to the Mormons, got his pay, some $400 or $500, and went his way. What eventually became of this manuscript is not known, but it was probably destroyed, so the whole matter remains a great extent a mystery yet unsolved. And that's true, friends. It still remains unsolved. It was during my residence in Virginia and on the Pacific coast many years after I left Amity that Mormonism was invented and had its growth, but until my return to the East in 1867, I paid little or no attention to the subject and for some time considered it a harmless delusion. Like other heresies which had sprung up, had their day and passed away. Seeing in the newspapers frequent reference to the names of Solomon Spalding, Sidney Rigdon, and Joseph Miller, revived my recollections of early life at Amity, my intimate acquaintance with Mr. Spalding and Mr. Miller, and what the former told me about his having written in Ohio a romance or historical novel called The Manuscript Found, his suspicions about Rigdon, etc. I was thus led to examine the publication made at that time, particularly a work written by Professor Turner, letters of Mrs. Davidson, formerly Mrs. Spalding, and by Mrs. McKinstry, her daughter, the testimony of John Spalding, Henry Lake, and others, all tending to prove that the Mormon Bible was a fraud, an impostor, and not a second revelation of the will of God as claimed, but taken from or founded upon a romance or novel written by Solomon Spalding. This was public sentiment at the time, and I believe to be correct. At the close, I was driven in the carriage by J.F. Miller to the residence of his father, my old friend Joseph Miller. On the road to Amity, he had read the Book of Mormon carefully, was convinced that it was founded substantially upon the work written by Mr. Spalding in Ohio. He was a particular friend of Mr. Spalding, who died in October 1816, a month or two after I had left the village. He told me that he attended Mr. Spalding in his last illness in company with Dr. Dodd, the pastor of the church. Superintended his funeral and afterwards settled up his business. He said that Mr. Spaulding suffered greatly at times by reason of the rupture, but appeared submissive and peacefully passed away, that he thought him a sincere Christian and his death a great loss to the community. So, I hope you can see all the statements here of what we read, and we see that not everything's going to be perfect. And I really hope that you can get a bigger and better picture of what we have seen thus far. Thank you so much for being with us.